Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to prime grizzly bear habitat just outside of DuBois, Wyoming. This area is very high elevation, with the valley bottom soaring to 7,000 feet high. The peaks to the south of town scrape the clouds at over 13,000 feet high and create a precipitation trap that keeps the valleys between lush and green. This is called orographic lift if you are interested in the scientific term. The forests here consist of pine, fir, and spruce trees, mingled with stands of quaking aspen, glittering their golden splendor each fall. Common animals here are antelope, elk, moose, and mule deer. Dominant predators in the area include black bears, bobcats, cougars, coyotes, and wolves, with the most ferocious of them all being grizzly bears. On the second day of October 2016, 59-year-old Lee Brooke had been hunting elk with his brother-in-law, George Neal, and two other friends. Lee was the local Maytag repairman back in Westfield, Pennsylvania, where everyone knew him by his name. His longtime wife, Martha, supported Lee's hunting obsession and appreciated his sense of adventure. Lee was an avid elk hunter. He had ventured out for the past 7 years and had great success, and this trip was no different. He had managed to bag a bull elk on opening day, but was forced to leave the carcass overnight due to the desire to avoid running into a bear while trudging through the dark. In the morning, Lee and his hunting buddies were heading back to recover the elk Lee killed the prior day. Lee's elk hunting season was over, so he left his hunting rifle back at camp and didn't pack bear spray. The only thing he carried with him was a serrated kitchen knife so that he could cut the carcass up to pack it out. Lee separated from the rest of the group as he was comfortable in the familiar area. As Lee approached the spot he'd left his elk carcass, he could see that it had been moved a short distance and was now covered in duff, sticks, and dirt. He knew this was clear sign that a bear had claimed his elk carcass. He also knew that when a bear claims a carcass, they will frequently lay down and guard it a short distance away. Now realizing that the bear may be too close for comfort, Lee turned around to see a dreaded sight. Off in the brush, the form of a very big sow grizzly materialized before his eyes. Strike one. Right beside her were her two cubs. That's strike two. A protective mama bear guarding an animal carcass she was claiming as food. That's strike three. Mother Nature doesn't always grant 3 strikes before an out. As soon as he saw the grizzly, Lee turned and began to run. He got about 2 steps into his panicked retreat when his motion suddenly stopped. The sow had stopped him in his tracks by biting into his backpack. In a motion too quick to avoid, the sow swatted Lee upside his head, knocking him out cold and sending him flying down the slope a few yards. While he was unconscious, the bear swatted and bit him for an additional 15 yards further down the hill, until she had fully vented her fury. As he came to, Lee's vision was blurry, and his head pounded as he regained consciousness. He could hear heavy breathing as the sow stood over him, and the whiskers of her muzzle brushing against his face brought Lee back to reality. As he lay there, a voice told Lee that he had to fight back. With all of his force, Lee struck out at the sow's face with his left fist and connected. Before Lee could pull his arm back for another strike, the sow bit into his forearm. Lee's right hand was still in his pants pocket. Before the sow knocked him out with her first swat, he was apparently reaching for the only defense that he'd brought, the kitchen knife. Now clenching the kitchen knife, Lee rose to his knees. He used the sow's grip on his left forearm to stay close to her as he plunged the kitchen knife into the side of her head repeatedly. The surprise and aggression of Lee's counterattack apparently terrified the bear. She turned and disappeared into the brush as Lee stood to his feet. He searched for her form in the brush, but couldn't seem to move or focus his eyes. No matter how hard he tried, he could only see the ground, but everything else was blurred by the blood in his eyes and the damage done to his face by the sow. Lee knew that he had been beaten and battered by the bear, and that he had to get help quickly. He glanced around and could see his mustache and nose laying on the ground near the log he was laying against previously. He grabbed them and put them in his pocket before feeling his way on his hands and knees for 40 yards around the hill. The short crawl exhausted Lee, and he crawled to the base of a nearby pine tree. He leaned back against the tree trunk and began to yell for help, hoping a member of his hunting party would hear his cries. As the desperation of his situation set in, Lee cried out, "Lord, I could use some help right about now." Lee's brother-in-law, George Neal, heard his cries after a few hours and used them to hone in on Lee's location. As he approached Lee, he couldn't recognize the agonizing man in front of him. Where Lee's face used to be was a mass of blood and clots and torn tissue. Lee was missing his nose and nearly all of his upper lip, but incredibly, he was conscious and alert. George muttered to himself, "Oh no, this ain't gonna be good." Judging by the dried black blood on Lee's clothes and face, George knew Lee had been there for too long already. He took off his shirt and draped it over Lee's shoulders to keep him warm. Lee wasn't in any shape to walk out, so a couple who were hiking nearby agreed to get help and hiked out toward the road. By the time the medical team had arrived to bring Lee to the hospital, he'd been laying on the mountain for 7 hours. They transported him to a small hospital in Riverton, Wyoming, where his condition was stabilized. After doing what they could do for Lee, the hospital arranged for a medical helicopter to fly him to Swedish Medical Center in Englewood, Colorado, for more intensive care. This is where Lee's luck turned for the better. A husband and wife team of plastic surgeons agreed to do what they could to restore Lee's face as much as they could. They had opened their practice only 2 weeks prior, but had all the experience, training, and education to remedy Lee's injuries. They immediately attached Lee's severed nose to his radial artery in his arm and buried it beneath the skin of his wrist. They used medical leeches to establish blood flow to it, but were unable to save his upper lip. During the medical examinations, it had been determined that the bear had crushed the entire left side of Lee's body during the attack. Nearly every bone in his face and skull had extensive damage. Lee's eye sockets were damaged, which explained why his vision was impaired immediately following the attack. His jaw was broken in multiple places, and the gaping hole left where his nose used to be was packed with dirt and twigs. Their first concerns were to stop the bleeding and clean Lee's wounds. Infection could set in and create a complication that may claim Lee's life, so removing all debris from his wounds was meticulously performed. They also did a skin graft from his leg to cover the hole in his face to prevent further contamination. Lee was given a 1% chance of living based on the severity of his injuries. The surgical staff put Lee into a medically induced coma for the first month of his recovery, as they monitored for signs of infection and healing. Worried that Lee would be unsure of what he had experienced and react with anger, the doctors were relieved when he woke up and could see he was alert and thankful. Lee quickly garnered the nickname The Revenant from the nurses on his floor. Over the following 3 months, Lee would suffer through 12 surgeries, one of which lasted for 24 hours. Bones were taken from his lower leg and used to reconstruct his face, and cartilage was removed from his rib and used to reconstruct his nose. Metal plates that were implanted to hold his facial bones in place, affixed by screws, gave Lee an opportunity to joke that if he behaved oddly in the future, that he may actually have a screw loose. As if his physical injuries weren't enough, Lee also suffered from PTSD from the bear attack. He went from surgeries and physical therapy to mental therapy for most of many days. He had to learn how to eat again, among many other previously routine activities. His community back in Westfield organized a fundraiser to help Lee and Martha to offset the costs of his health care, and Lee's appearance garnered rousing applause. Following his injuries, Lee was unable to return to his appliance repair business and has been waiting to see what life will bring him and his wife. Martha expressed gratitude that Lee survived, stating that his injuries could have been worse. She says she would have been heartbroken with the loss of her husband and best friend. Lee's one regret is that due to the loss of his upper lip and the nerves in that part of his face, he will never again feel his wife's kisses. That is the biggest loss to him. In total, Lee and Martha spent years away from home as he had surgical procedures so frequently. The bear attack that nearly took Lee's life from him and her husband from Martha did nothing to stop their love of hunting. They still make hunting trips and enjoy their time in the woods together. As for the grizzly sow and her cubs, the only information I could find indicated that she weighed around 420 pounds. But no source indicated what came of her. I could find no mention of any attempt to kill or capture her, nor if she died from the wounds inflicted by Lee with the kitchen knife. It is assumed that she survived the wounds and continued to raise her cubs unaffected by further human intervention. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think bear spray or a firearm would have made a difference in this attack? Do you think the cubs learned to attack human beings from what they observed their mom do to Lee? The next time you go for a walk in the woods, will you treat every large pile of sticks with at least a little suspicion? I know I will. I'll enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Pogo Gold Mine about 340 miles northeast of Anchorage, Alaska. The gold mine opened in 1989 and sits in steep and brushy country about 40 miles northwest of the town of Delta Junction. This area has been the site of environmental research ever since mining started, and the Goodpaster River drainage is one of the locations scrutinized and monitored. The elevation of the drainage varies around 2,400 feet above sea level, with rolling mountains to the south and larger ones to the north. The dense brush covering the land is comprised mostly of alder, willow, and other brush under 10 feet in height, with occasional stands of spruce and birch trees. The animals common here are moose and caribou primarily, with predators being coyotes, wolves, black bears, and brown bears. At 10:30 a.m. on Monday, June 19, 2017, 27-year-old Aaron Johnson and 38-year-old Ellen Traynor were taking soil samples along Goodpaster River. Ellen hailed from Fairbanks and worked as a biologist for Alaska Biological Research Incorporated, which was contracted to do biological impact studies by the mine owners. Aaron worked there in the same role and grew up in Chugiak near Anchorage. She spent her youth wandering the nearby forests and playing sports. Aaron's interest for sports and the outdoors probably started with her family owning a chain of outfitting stores called Jack's Outdoor Gear in northern Colorado. She was a member of the U.S. Junior Olympic Nordic Ski Team in 2006 and 2007. Aaron was trained as a geologist and botanist at the University of Montana and the University of Alaska Anchorage. She had already adventured her way around some of the most secluded corners of the globe by this early age. Aaron and her husband Gabe were married just 2 weeks prior to this day. At the role as biologists for ABR, both women had completed numerous classes on bear safety. Their broad and extensive experience outdoors only added to their knowledge base. Aaron and Ellen had packed into their site about 5 miles from the mine for soil samples and still had the backpacks on their shoulders. As they pushed their way through the thick brush, they chatted about being bear-aware. Aaron was about 5 yards up the trail when Ellen heard a rustling in the bushes just behind her. Ellen turned to find the source of the rustling and watched a 300-pound bear appear only 15 feet from her. The bear looked like it could be a grizzly bear, but before she could really analyze it, it was already rushing toward her. Ellen reached down toward her bear spray in its holster on the waist strap of her backpack. Before she could touch the can of spray, the bear closed the distance and drove Ellen into the dirt face first. The bear started to tear at her backpack with savage and irresistible force, jerking her around with each toss of its head. Aaron watched as the bear straddled Ellen during the attack. She began to yell at the bear in an attempt to drive it off, but it didn't relent. After only a few seconds, the bear lifted its head from Ellen and fixed its gaze on Aaron. Her screams had finally drawn its full attention, and now it approached her. Now, we've already mentioned how Aaron had had training on how to handle a run-in with a bear. Undoubtedly, she'd been taught to do the same thing that Ellen had done. While the bear attacked Ellen, she may have had time to reach for her bear spray and pulled it from her shoulder strap on her backpack, but she did none of these things. And the reason why can only be attributed to overwhelming fear. I've been there myself many times in Idaho and Alaska. When a bear's eyes fix on you, all the plans you have to protect yourself in your rational mind go out the window. The unpredictable nature of a bear becomes a reality, and you realize you have no way of anticipating precisely what it will do next. Ellen's face was buried in her hands as she stared at the ground. She could hear Erin's screams turn into gurgling as the bear mauled her. She reached her hand down to her bear spray and pulled the canister from its holster. Ellen flicked off the safety cap from her bear spray and discharged a cloud of irritant in the bear's direction. The bear immediately charged back toward her and tore at her backpack with continued fury and showed no effects or reactions to the spray. Upon seeing no reaction from Ellen, the bear returned to Erin and began dragging her lifeless body down the hill by her head. Ellen took this opportunity to spray the bear once again, causing it to charge back toward her one more time. She covered up her head and neck with her arms once again and laid still. The bear sniffed around her for a few seconds and then returned again to Erin. Ellen now considered that this bear was intent on killing and eating the women, likely both of them. She reached around to her backpack slowly and searched for her radio. Grasping it, she pulled it toward her head and clicked it on. Urgently, she sent out a mayday cry for help, relaying the fact that they were being attacked by a bear. She stated that the bear spray was not working and a weapon was needed. Stephen Herrero is one of the top researchers on bear attacks and preventative measures on how to stop or avoid them. His research indicates that black bears tend to recover from exposure to bear spray faster than the other bear species. This may explain why this bear was so resistant to the effects of the bear spray. His work has been cited on previous episodes on this channel. Ellen's reaction to the bear attack was the appropriate method when dealing with a surprise grizzly bear confrontation, but it is not advisable for a predatory black bear attack. Still laying face down, she listened as the bear moved through the brush surrounding the women. She had no idea if Erin was still alive or not. At 10:40 a.m., Ellen's radio message was received by the coordinator at the mine. A helicopter arrived only a few minutes after Ellen's message was received. The crew of the helicopter could see the bear dragging something through the brush as they approached. Instead of searching for a landing spot, they decided to buzz the bear with the helicopter. Flying right over the bear, they frightened it away, giving Ellen space to flee from it. Via the radio, they directed her down a trail away from the bear to a clearing. They landed and picked her up to fly her back to the mine. While at the mine, the helicopter crew added an armed guard, packing a .338 high-powered rifle. Upon returning to the location of the attack, they spotted the bear as it dragged Erin's corpse downhill once again. The guard fired the rifle and struck the bear from a hovering helicopter at an undisclosed distance. After being struck by the bullet, the bear released its grip on Erin's head and ran up the hill. 2 more shots rang out from the guard's rifle before the bear collapsed, finally dead. After finding a suitable landing spot nearby, the crew and guard disembarked the helicopter. They approached the location they last saw the bear and found Erin's body. About 50 yards away, they also located the bear's carcass. Erin's corpse and the bear's carcass were taken back for analysis, and examinations of Erin's injuries indicated that she'd fought the bear with everything she had. She had several bite wounds on her left arm and her left side, indicating she may have curled into a ball to protect the more vulnerable parts of her body. The significant and fatal wounds were found to be deep and crushing bites to her head and neck. Her body had scratches and scrape marks on her thighs from being dragged through the brush by her head. Her cell phone was found on her corpse, but her backpack was never located. During a necropsy on the bear's carcass, it was determined that the black bear was a 6 to 8 year old boar. In its stomach were found pieces of fabric, Erin's clothes, or Ellen's backpack. There was also some grass and cartilage from a calf moose. Investigators noted that the bear had very little to no subcutaneous body fat, but did have a healthy amount of visceral fat in its abdominal area, indicating it was not starving, but was likely very hungry. The necropsy revealed that the bear had eaten no meat in several days, so it was not defending a cached animal carcass. Given it was a male, it was not defending any cubs. The bear's approach to Ellen was also telling. It didn't roar or growl, which it would likely do in a surprise defensive attack. Given it had closed on her from a short distance and pounced on her from behind, investigators concluded that the bear had strictly predatory motives in its attack on the women. They also concluded that had the women dispensed their bear spray earlier, it may have prevented the attack, but were skeptical that it would have been enough to prevent such an aggressive bear from continuing its attack. Ellen was treated at the local hospital in Fairbanks after a ride there in an ambulance. Her injuries were not severe, and she was released the same day she was admitted. Warning signs were posted at the trailhead, and all visitors were kept away from the area. Aaron's fatal attack happened one day after the fatal black bear attack on 16-year-old Patrick Cooper as he ran in a hill climb race on Bird Ridge near Anchorage. His attack is presented in an episode on this channel and is linked to in the article description below this episode. Over the last 130 years, there have only been 6 fatal black bear attacks in Alaska. Aaron's death was the first human fatality to have occurred when bear spray was used as a defense. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think this bear was somehow resistant to the effects of bear spray? Given the number of shots taken from the guard's rifle to bring the bear down, would a firearm have made any difference in Aaron's attack? What more could Aaron and Ellen have done to prevent or stop this bear attack? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Butler Township in western Pennsylvania. Around the town of Butler, dense and large stands of trees encircle the town in a beautiful touch of wilderness, or about as close as you can get to it in this area. About 30 miles to the south, the large city of Pittsburgh bustles with car and industry noise of any modern major city. But Butler is much more quiet and peaceful. On the outskirts of town are expansive farms and fields, reaching out around 10 miles away from the city. These fields are interrupted by creek bottoms that have dense riparian zones of trees and brush, creating travel routes for all kinds of wildlife. In a housing development north of Butler called Homemaker-Lindora Housing Development, the homes back up to a beautiful stretch of woods that still have their untouched character. Area residents have been seeing black bears around their neighborhood over the last decade or so. In fact, it isn't uncommon for residents to get footage of bears on their doorbell cameras during the night. When Nancy Godno, a resident on Jarrett Avenue, reported a sighting of a bear, local authorities warned her to remove any bird feeders and to walk her dog during the daylight hours. Nancy had spotted over 10 bears in her neighborhood in the last month, and being from the city, wasn't exactly comfortable with their presence. She reported that a bear had recently followed her dog to her front door, leaving evidence of its prints in the snow. Cottonelle was advised to put up a fence around her property to keep the bears from entering. Over on Belfield Drive, 55-year-old Leanne Galante was winding down for the night while her husband was out of the house. Lee worked as a dental hygienist and was excited about a trip she'd planned to Italy, set to begin in a month. She had never been overseas and looked forward to this adventure. Her constant companion was her 7-year-old Pomeranian dog, Smokey, who tipped the scales at only 8 pounds. She was a black fuzzball of energy and affection for Leanne. The Galantes had their own history with the local black bear population. In 2009, one of their bird feeders was knocked down by a visiting black bear, and then the bears returned in February 2024. Her neighbors had doorbell video footage of a sow with 3 large cubs visiting the neighborhood bird feeders and rummaging in trash cans for food. At 8:30 p.m. on Tuesday, March 5, 2024, Leanne was headed toward the back door to let Smokey take a bedtime potty break. As she turned on the lights, she could see the backlit silhouette of 3 large black bear cubs in a neighbor's tree close to her property. She glanced around and didn't see any other bears and wondered if the cubs were already on their own. She closed the door and retreated inside a few steps before hearing Smokey barking incessantly. Deciding she had better investigate what Smokey was up to, Leanne opened the back door to her home once again and stepped into the dark a few steps for a better view. Leanne examined the shadows of her backyard and took a few steps towards Smokey, who was barking near the garden. There was a fence around the garden, and as she peered into the darkness, a huge, angry sow black bear climbed over it and started closing in on Smokey. As the black bear charged toward Smokey, it huffed and chuffed in rage at the nuisance the little dog presented. Leanne immediately began yelling for Smokey to come to her. She was afraid that the bear would kill Smokey, and screamed to stop the bear from getting to her dog. The sow quickly approached Smokey, then turned its head toward Leanne. Curving its path toward Leanne, the bear streaked toward her at speed too fast for her to consider reacting. She managed to turn slightly away from the bear before feeling an overwhelming force slam her to the concrete slab of her back patio. As the smack of her head resounded, the dental hygienist's only fears were that her teeth might be broken. Before Leanne could come to her senses, the sow bit her left arm and tossed her head, causing pain to shoot through Leanne's body. Smoky wasn't about to let her buddy fight this bear alone, and darted in and out, barking and growling to draw the bear's attention away from Leanne. For an instant, the bear was distracted by Smoky and chased after the little dog. After Smoky scampered to a safe distance, the sow returned to Leanne and bit onto the back of her head. Feeling the bear's teeth sink into her scalp, Leanne screamed out for help in terror. Leanne's neighbor, Michael Vero, heard her cries for help. Her screams were nerve-wracking to him, and he wasn't sure what was going on next door. As the bear chewed on her head, Leanne was terrified that the sow was going to scalp her. The pressure of the bear's bite was irresistible, and the pain it caused was crippling. Leanne couldn't believe this was happening. She was convinced that this was it. She was going to die by a bear attack in her own backyard. That is when Smoky stormed back in for another distracting maneuver. The sow immediately turned her head toward the dog and dashed in that direction. Leanne was worried that the bear would eat her little baby, and the bear was likely thinking the same thing regarding her own babies. In a flash, the bear was back on top of Leanne. She glanced at her left arm and could see the bear's entire mouth wrapped around it. Smoky wasn't about to give up and initiated another ferocious attack of barking and growling as she ran toward the bear. Drawing the bear off of Leanne, Smoky retreated to the safety of the porch as the sow backed off in the direction of the tree holding her cubs. Leanne took this chance to crawl toward her back door. As she did, the sow continually bluff-charged and stormed around in a rage. As soon as she entered her home, Leanne closed the door and crawled across the kitchen floor toward her phone. She was certain that, had they not made it inside the home when they did, the bear would have killed her and Smoky. Smoky dashed upstairs as soon as she entered the home and hid under the bed. Leanne dialed 911 and begged for help. As she waited for the ambulance, she dreadfully considered what the back of her head looked like. She knew she was severely injured, as she was gushing blood from the wound there. Once the ambulance arrived at her address, they whisked her to Butler Memorial Hospital in town. Once she arrived at the hospital, Leanne's wound to her head was closed with dozens of surgical staples. The medical staff there determined that Leanne suffered a broken nose and facial bones, with puncture wounds to her head, neck, face, and arms from the sow's teeth and claws. Her scalp was torn open, and she suffered several gashes as well. Leanne's doctors say she was lucky that her injuries weren't more severe. Her pictures wouldn't pass YouTube guidelines, so I've posted them to my Patreon link below in the video article. If you'd like to take a look at them, they will show you what a bear will do to you. Dr. Philp was one of the trauma specialists working on Leanne's injuries. He indicated that over his 23-year career, he only had 1 or 2 other bear attack victims, and they were related to hunting. He stated that Leanne's was the first time his victim was attacked in her own backyard. Leanne's long-term prognosis is good, and she will make a full recovery after facial reconstruction surgery. When authorities investigated Leanne's neighborhood in search of the bear, they found the 4 bears had sought shelter in a tree. Upon arriving, the sow was very aggressive toward the officers, fostering concerns she might have rabies. Given that a rabies test can only be conducted on a dead animal, they had to euthanize her to find out. Her 3 cubs were sedated and held until a decision regarding their fate could be determined by the outcome of the rabies test on their mother. The rabies test was completed rapidly and was negative, indicating that her cubs could be released to live on their own in remote Warren County in the Allegheny National Forest. The video of their release is on my Patreon account if you'd like to view it there. The Pennsylvania Game Commission indicated that the sow was likely hungry and protecting her cubs. The neighborhood bird feeders likely proved too tempting for the sow, as she provided for herself and her cubs. For those of you who are wondering about Smoky, Leanne didn't get a chance to see him before she was taken to the hospital. Her son picked Smoky up and took him to the vet for an exam after his mother was admitted. It revealed that Smoky had a single small claw wound. That was her only injury. Leanne and Smoky were reunited as soon as she was discharged by Thursday afternoon of the same week. Leanne's neighbor, Nancy Godno, expressed frustration at authorities' lack of response prior to Leanne's bear attack. She stated that the bear could have been trapped and relocated before the incident had occurred. Leanne's bear attack was the third one in the past year in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Game Commission indicates that there are about 2 bear attacks each year in the state, but points out that there has never been a fatal bear attack in Pennsylvania. Black bear populations in Pennsylvania have grown from 5,000 bears in 1980 to around 18,000 bears today. After reviewing the details of Leanne's bear attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think that game officials have been lackadaisical in their approach to the dangers black bears represent to citizens? Do you think a hazing program is in order to reestablish boundaries between bears and humans? Would relocating problem bears be a viable solution to the bear problems? Are you going to run out and buy a brave little black Pomeranian anytime soon? I might have to do that. I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.